The people who lived in pre-American Alaska had to learn how to survive in a harsh and inhospitable landscape. It was often cold, but it was often beautiful, abundant, and challenging. Here's everything you didn't know about life in pre-American Alaska. When you picture the Ice Age in your mind, you probably imagine a land choked by glaciers and very little, if any, green. How exactly does one survive in a land with nothing but ice? It turns out that common perception is actually a misperception. According to the University of Alaska Fairbanks, the interior of Alaska was actually green during the last ice age. While it's true that parts of the future state were locked up in ice, the interior was actually something of a paradise. That's because so much of the world's oceans were frozen that the sea level dropped by about 400 feet, exposing the Bering Land Bridge and briefly connecting Alaska and Siberia. All that land actually helped to further isolate the Alaskan interior from the ocean moisture, which in turn led to warm summers and relatively mild winters.
Unusual weather we're having, ain't it?
More than 11,000 years ago, two mothers buried their babies in the cold ground of their fishing camp in what is now modern Alaska. The infants were placed on a red ochre and surrounded by hunting darts made out of antlers. The care with which they were buried reminds us that ancient people loved and grieved just as we still do today, and they also gave archaeologists important insight into the genetic origins of Native Americans. One of the two babies was between 6 and 12 weeks old, and the other was likely stillborn. They were buried in the same ceremonial fashion, but they were from two very different genetic lineages, neither of which are common to the modern population of Native Americans. This means that the people who lived in Alaska 11,500 years ago were a lot more genetically diverse than previously believed. This finding seems to support the theory that the people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge must have been isolated from their Siberian ancestors for a very long period of time. The people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge during and soon after the Ice Age would have seen animals that are familiar to today's Alaskans, like the bighorn sheep and elk. But as they moved into the interior, they would have encountered creatures that would turn modern humans into terrified piles of quivering bear food. The early settlers likely shared territory with animals that we can only imagine, such as woolly mammoths, American lions, and the giant short-faced bear. That last one was about 12 feet tall when standing upright, and therefore about 4 to 7 feet larger than a grizzly bear and probably not very afraid of humans. It turns out that early Alaskans actually hunted mammoth, mastodons, and other large animals, and some researchers think they even had a hand in those animals' eventual extinction. The fossil record suggests that the decline of these species correlated with the migration of humans from Thuringia into North America. Others, though, believe it was mostly climate change that was to blame. As the region warmed, the scrub tundra spread to the steppe and outcompeted the vegetation that larger herbivores depended on. Whatever the reason for the extinction, it's still cool that human beings once looked out across the land and saw massive herds of mammoths, and sad to know that no one will ever see that again. Most scholars of ancient history agree that agriculture was the key to human civilization. Once people learned how to grow food and raise domesticated animals, they could build permanent settlements because there would no longer be the need to follow migrating herds or move on once all the roots had been gathered. Estimates at the beginning of agriculture typically place it around 12,000 years ago. But in Alaska, there's no significant tradition of farming. Instead, there's evidence that people were setting up permanent villages around the same time that they were harvesting very large amounts of food. For example, evidence for things like plank house construction and permanent hearths start to appear in the archaeological record around 5,200 years ago. By 3,200 years ago, it's clear that people were skilled at building large wooden fish weirs for the massed harvest of salmon. According to the Alaskan Department of Natural Resources, these developments were followed by things like fortification, which suggests that villages were sometimes targeted by other clans. Clearly, with civilization comes other people who are jealous of that civilization. So the native Alaskans really weren't so different from any other human civilization anywhere ever.
Alaska, a place where you can't be too fat or too drunk, where no one says things like, "Let's see your high school equivalency certificate."
Whaling today has a very bad reputation, mostly because large commercial whaling operations have been responsible for driving many species to the brink of extinction. But for a lot of native Alaskan people, whales were an important resource. And the history of whaling in the area goes back at least 2,500 years, when the tribes of the Bering Sea were hunting whales in small kayaks or boats made of walrus hide. The hunters would wound their prey with a harpoon and then sometimes follow it for days until it finally died. If that sounds awful, just try to remember how harsh the living conditions were for these ancient hunters and how many meals one whale could represent. Nowadays, whales are still a major source of food for the Inuit people, and for some cultures, the hunt is more about tradition than about subsistence. Either way, the practice is now controversial, and like so much of what made pre-American Alaska special, it may one day become nothing more than a memory of the past. Check out one of our newest videos right here, plus even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.